Hey, everyone who's just joining us. I'd
Yeah.
just like to invite you all to, in the chat, let us know where you're from or where you're tuning in from. We'll see. Just
kind of curious.
Dairylandia we have represented in our group here today.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for our first Saturday event with Steve Hanna. We're very happy to have you all here. And before we get going with our conversation this morning, we just have a very short video to share with you, and we'll be right back with some introductions and we'll get underway. And on the other side of this.
Welcome to the 2020 Central Wisconsin Book Festival. This week of amazing events is possible only because of the support of our sponsors, which include
Marathon County Public Library,
the Friends of the Marathon County Public Library,
the MCPL Foundation,
the Community Arts Grant Program
of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin,
with funds provided by the Wisconsin Arts Board, which is a state agency,
the Community Foundation,
and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation,
the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service,
the Merco Foundation Fund,
Wisconsin Public Radio,
the Master Gardener Program of Marathon County,
North Central Area Congregations Organized to Make an Impact,
or Naomi,
and Yankee Bookstore.
Thank you to all of our friends and partners who make the Wisconsin Book Festival possible.
And we thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Alrighty, well, Steve Hanna, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us. You were with us Thursday night, and we're happy to have you back this morning to talk more about your book, Dairylandia. For those who don't know about Steve, he spent almost 2 decades as a pretty good reporter, sometime columnist, and managing editor of the Milwaukee Journal, now the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. He devoted 12 years of his life to writing a syndicated column called State of Mind, many of which are included in his book, and spent the last 10 years of his career as CEO of The Onion, America's finest news source. And a little more, he once spent a winter night in northern Wisconsin with a guy who invented a contraption that would take the whole shell off of a hard-boiled egg by employing an electrifying two-handed thrust that resembled the Heimlich maneuver. While the experience didn't exactly change his life, it was a lot more interesting than covering the state legislature, I bet.
That it was.
And these days he divides his time between his home on the Wisconsin River in Sauk County and Austin, Texas. Steve Hanna, welcome. Thanks again.
My pleasure. It's a pleasure to be invited anywhere these days.
So the book Dairylandia is a collection of your State of Mind columns. Take us back. When did you start writing the State of Mind columns, and how did that come about? How did you start writing these columns?
Desperation. Desperate. No, well, I worked for the Journal for all those years, and then I left just before the Journal and Sentinel were going to merge. I was, I wouldn't say ushered out, but I wasn't one of the great fans of putting the papers together, so I left. And I actually spent 10 years in, this is not going to excite anybody, in the investment business. In between, but I wanted to keep my hand in writing, and I had been just the president of the Associated Press in Wisconsin. So I knew all the editors, which is really important because then you can go and say to them, hey, buy my column, which I did shamelessly. And so I started it in 1994. I left the Journal in 93 and started in the investment business in 94. But at the same time, I had an arrangement with my employer that I would be able to take time out every week to write the column. So I wrote it for 12 years, including the first 2 years of my CEO stint at The Onion. But pretty soon that business changed so dramatically. We expanded. We had, most people think The Onion was only in Madison, but we had 19 different newspapers from Toronto all the way to Los Angeles. So I was on the road constantly, and we were doing television shows as well because the handwriting was on the wall that the print product was beginning to lose advertising to digital. So that's more than you wanted to know. The answers, I guess I could have just said 12 years, 94 to 2006.
Interesting. And so you started it as a way to just kind of keep writing, or give some balance in your life. You know, you had an investment on one side, and fun people watching and people writing on another side.
Yes, I wanted to keep my hand in it. All these years later, and I think this is in the book. I haven't read the book in a while, unfortunately. But I got into management at the Journal company, and I think that's Pat Peckham right there. Hello, Pat. In any event, Pat's not talking to me. I must have done something to him.
No, he was muted, but yeah. Anyway, continue.
Okay. Yeah. What was the question, Jed?
Just, he started the column as a way to just kind of keep writing and
Yeah. Oh, I see where I was
in the game.
Yeah, in years earlier, I had gone from full-time writing into management, or as my friend said, the dark side. And then I sort of went up. I was the city editor and the metropolitan editor and the managing editor, and eventually the executive editor of the Journal. So that was like running a business, frankly. Those were the grand old days when we had 330 people in the newsroom at the Milwaukee Journal and 2.5 million readers on Sunday, that 7 editions every single day. So, I got into that for the money. I was raising a young family, and I remember calling my father and saying, I really love this writing gig, but I got an opportunity to get into management. And my father said, in his typical way, he said, "How much does it pay?" And when I told him, he said, "Take it." And so I wrote at the Journal. I continued to write. I did a lot of foreign reporting, actually, for the Journal. I reported from China, and I reported from India and Japan. I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, and also I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland. I had gone to graduate school in Dublin, and I went back to Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles, after Bobby Stans had starved himself, and it was a wonderful experience, and most beneficial because I was so scared for the 6 weeks I was there that I lost 18 pounds.
Wow. Yeah, that's.
I should probably get another assignment like that today.
So when you were looking for people and places to write about for the State of Mind column, how did you find them? I mean, I imagine after a while, once the column got established and really started to take off and spread and was syndicated, people probably sent you ideas all the time. Hey, you ought to write about this. But in the early days, did you just kind of tap your previous reporting knowledge, like stuff that you had kind of filed away for later? How did you find topics to write about for your column?
Well, you're right on the first part, that as the column grew, 2, 3, 4 years into the column, I'd get mail every single week from people, and sometimes they'd say, "That was a really nice column, Steve," and sometimes they'd say, "That column sucked. What were you thinking?" But often somebody said, "If you thought that was good, I've got somebody who you should interview." So very often people, total strangers who were reading, I think at its height, the column had about 500,000 weekly circulation around Wisconsin, because we had 35 daily newspapers in those days. And it was running in 20 or 21 or 22 of them at any given time. So I got lots of ideas from the readers. I got lots of ideas from my friends. There's a chapter in the book that we discussed briefly the other night. I think I made a reference to it, about a rattlesnake hunter, a guy named Woodrow Wilson Roberts. And this is kind of typical in a way. My next door neighbor came home. He belonged to the Optimist Club in Sauk City. And he came home one night and he said, let me tell you what happened today. We said, we were sitting there. We usually talk about what the prospects for the high school football team in Sauk Prairie. And he said, but today this guy walks in and he's as big as a house and he's got a flannel shirt on and a pair of bib overalls, and we're all dressed up looking very pretty in our suits. And the guy, without a word, he has a burlap bag over his shoulder and he opens the bag up and 6 rattlesnakes drop on the floor. That was the end of the lunch. Basically, everybody retreated to the back of the room. But he said, this is your kind of guy. And it turned out that he was my kind of guy. I went to see him. I called him and he said, absolutely, come on over and see me. He said, and when I got there, I explained to him a few times that I had never particularly cared for snakes, any kind of snake at all. Even earthworms scared me. And Woody was such a character that he would look at me and say, I know you're a boy who thinks he's scared of snakes, but I know boys. And I was like 45 at the time. And he said, and you're the kind of boy who could learn to love snakes. And I said, I don't think it's ever going to happen, Woody. But so that was my next door neighbor. There's a chapter that I particularly like in the book about a woman named Emma Washa, who was the oldest living newspaper columnist. She lived down in Castle Rock. And Emma was also a woodpile relative of a woman I knew. And one day I had really good friends who were always on the lookout for ideas. So she said, you should go see Emma Washa because she's the oldest living newspaper columnist, certainly in Wisconsin. And turned out, according to editor and publisher who picked the story up later, that she was the oldest living newspaper columnist in the world. And she was still writing until she died at 105. And so I did maintain relationships with these people because, it wasn't really kosher to say this when you were a journalist because you were supposed to be objective. Nowadays, you don't have to be objective. Nobody's objective. It's a point of pride not to be objective. But in those days, there were some of my children, that is my column subjects, who I certainly liked better than others, although I liked many of them. But Emma was just a fascinating, sweet lady. And I liked, and I mentioned this the other night in that humor, I liked old people. And now I'm one of those old people, and I'm not too fond of myself, but I liked old people because they were so candid and so unfiltered, and there was nothing calculating about them. They were completely, utterly happy with who they were. And if you wanted the pleasure of their company and you wanted to sit down and talk to them, that was okay with them. And if you didn't, that was okay with them too. They didn't care. I think I mentioned the other night when I went to see her, 7 or 8 years after the first column I'd written about her. And she lived in a nursing home at the time. And the nurse walked in and said, guess what? You're going to have a visitor today. And it's going to be Steve Hanna. Remember Steve? And she said, yeah, I remember Steve. And she said, I bet this is going to, make you pretty excited. And she said, well, I'll be glad to see him, but honestly, I won't be that excited. And she told me the same thing when I got there. She said, I was happy to see you and hear you were coming, but I can't say I was excited. It takes a lot to get me excited. So these ideas came, and then other ideas came. I always loved what I know Pat Peckham remembers as what we called the briefs in the newspaper, which were just not the long stories, but the 1 or 2 paragraph stories that would just have an interesting little factoid in it. And you just knew that there was something behind the story, that there was so much more to it. And often I'd come across a paragraph. I read a lot of newspapers. And I'd come across a paragraph and it would just say something about somebody. And I'd say, God, there's gotta be more to that story. It could be anything from the world's greatest frogger from O'Connell, Wisconsin, who caught frogs commercially for his whole life. And I thought anybody who spent that much time with frogs has gotta be entertaining. And he was terribly entertaining. Or it could be, I read a paragraph one time in the Madison paper that said that a woman named Ellen Court because the book is, as you know, Julie knows, for example, is not entirely. These are not all. It's not. It has funny moments, but the book isn't really entirely about humor.
Sure.
It's not. It wasn't inspired by the Onion. My Onion years.
Right,
It was inspired by really the State of Mind years.
Sure.
But I would meet people who were funny and some people who were not particularly funny, but often it was just that paragraph. Ellen Court, I started to say. I'm kind of like Mark Twain in the sense that once someone said about him he could never march a straight line in a conversation. That's kind of what you get with me too, unfortunately. But Ellen Court was just a paragraph that said she was had been named, Tommy Thompson had named her the first poet laureate of Wisconsin. She was from Appleton. She was really a fascinating individual. And so I would call her and say, can I come up and see you? And I think that's a terrific, not to pitch the book, but I do want to pitch the book, of course. But I think that's a fascinating story in there. I also remember that reading, I was up at the library one day. So this is another avenue of getting story ideas. I was up at the library. I was up in Appleton for something one day. I had some time to kill. So I went to the Houdini library there. And when I was going through it, I thought that was fascinating. And at the end, I asked the lady who ran the place, I said, is there anybody who's like Houdini today or who has modeled his or her life after Houdini? And she said, of course. And I said, well, who would that be? And she said, it's Rondini. And I said, Rondini? She said, yeah, his name's Ron. And then he added the Dini on the end. So I called Rondini. And if from your part of the world, you'll probably remember Shriners, which just closed, a terrible thing. So I met Rondini at Shriners, and Rondini told me about his life and his living homage to Houdini. And I didn't put this in the book. I was going to, but in the end I didn't. But it won't stop me from telling you anyway. At the very end, it was about a 95-degree day, and we walked out into the parking lot to say, the interview was concluded. And I said to Rondini, is there anything that you're really good at that Houdini did? And he said, yeah, I'm a terrific escape artist. And he said, for example, often in my act, I'm tied up in a straitjacket and I can get out in less than 2 minutes. And he lifted up the trunk of his car and he had a straitjacket in the back of the car. And mind you, this was the early seating for lunch at Shriners. So the average age of the people leaving the restaurant at that time was about, 92. And there were a lot of people in walkers and they were coming out. And the one interest, so I said to Rondini, well, why? I said, if I tie you up in the parking lot here in this straitjacket, are you telling me you'll get out in 2 minutes? And he said, absolutely. So I said, let's do it. And I mean, it was really hot. So I tied Rondini up. And now, mind you, you have to look at the backdrop where people are going by in walkers and being helped by their nurses' aides, et cetera. And nobody is paying any attention. I mean, they are, I'm doing this and they are deliberately they do not want to know what's going on here. What is this guy doing tying up somebody in the straitjacket? Yeah. And I tied him up in the straitjacket, and poor Rondini, he was sweating buckets and he blushed puce and he dropped to the ground immediately and then began to wiggle like Woody Roberts' bag full of snakes. And by God, he was out in like 1 minute and 45 seconds. And so I happened to be going through the museum the ideas, pretty soon the ideas came from some people and just other weird things I thought of, if something were happening in the world, I'd suddenly say, I bet there's somebody who does something like that in Wisconsin.
Yeah. That's got to be really fun. I mean, you just have to, I would imagine, or did have to, just keep your eyes and ears open to different possibilities. And it seems like you almost have to think of think in terms of everyone having a story. Everyone has a story, whether or not it's other people would find it interesting. That's the call that you had to make. But
Yes,
yeah,
everybody does have a story. And I learned that from my mother. My mother was a great storyteller. My mother was actually, in retrospect, she's been gone for about 25 years now, but today she would be diagnosed as agoraphobic. She hated to leave our home. And she was a librarian, with all due respect to all librarians, but that was a safe place for her. She loved books. There were 5 or 6 safe places. There was a meat market that she really liked. There was a supermarket that she liked. In those days, we had butcher shops and meat markets. But my mother always believed that there were people everybody had a story, and if you just asked them often enough, and you sat back and you were quiet enough, she made that. I was not always quiet, as you can tell from this. But my mother believed that somebody had a really good story. My mother was capable of, this happened so many times in my childhood, the phone would ring. My mother would go answer the phone, which was in a little pantry off the kitchen. And all of a sudden she'd come back and she'd get a cup of tea, and we could see the phone was still down, and she would get a cup of tea and also a pack of unfiltered Pall Mall cigarettes, which eventually was the death of her, but she enjoyed herself along the way. And she'd be on the phone for 45 minutes with someone, and then she'd come back, and we had 5 kids, and we'd say, "Who is that?" And she'd say, "Well, that's Mrs. Morgan, who lives over on Llewellyn Avenue, and she's married to a guy who, unfortunately, he works in New York City, but he gets pretty drunk every night before he gets on the train, so he's got a problem she's got to take care of, and one of her daughter's pregnant now, and her son is." And I'd say, "Well, do you know her?" And she said, "No, it's the wrong number." And I'd say, "Wrong number?" And she said, "Yeah, everybody's got a story to tell if you're just receptive." Sure. And my mother wanted me to stay home, and I was grew up in the East Coast, and so she'd always say, "And you don't have to go to Timbuktu in order to get their story. So
Sure.
Stay home."
So you did not grow up in Wisconsin. You're originally from the East Coast. But thinking about your book and the work of other people like Michael Perry, who wrote the foreword to your book, and now Charlie Berens and his Manitowoc Minute, as someone who's both lived in Wisconsin for a long time, but also did not grow up here, is there something unique about Wisconsinites that we like to read about ourselves and kind of lovingly mock ourselves and have some of our traits and foibles and stuff kind of turned around on ourselves? And is that kind of how you approached the column? Not necessarily to mock other, the people that you're writing about, but what is it about Wisconsinites that we like to laugh at ourselves?
Well, I think that it made me think of a story of I can think of 10 stories of Wisconsinites who did not like to laugh themselves, believe me, but I thought they were funny. I would say that, to answer your first question, I'm not sure Wisconsinites love to read about themselves. I think Wisconsinites are basically, a friend of mine once said Wisconsinites are self-actualized. So this immediately sent me to the dictionary to find out what that meant. And I decided after parsing through this definition and reading a psychological text about self-actualization, that it really means that there are people who are sort of happy with who they are. These are kind of random traits. They're unpretentious. They don't brag a lot. They believe, actually, they think bragging is a really terrible trait to have. That's what I found. And I found that, I think, Chad, to answer your question in a way, that so many of the people I wrote about were just shocked that I was at their doorstep. And they would say, you're doing what here? And I said, I'm going to write a story about you because your dog, that you've raised from a pup, your house was burning down and it saved the whole family. And so I'm really writing about your dog today. And he said, he was a farmer up near Fond du Lac, I think in Brownsville. And he said, you're going to get paid for this? I said, yes, but not well. I think Wisconsin people are inherently modest, and it may come from their roots. A friend of mine who is a lawyer in Madison tells me that it comes from the sort of German and Scandinavian background of so many Wisconsinites. I had a neighbor who lived next door to me out here on Lake Wisconsin who, when the sun was shining, and I would walk out and see her next door, and I'd look up at the sky and it was blue and the sun was shining, and I'd say, it's a beautiful day. And she was Norwegian, and one of my great sources of ideas. And she would always say to me, yeah, but, and then she'd sigh always. She'd go, no guarantees. She could rain any moment now, or a tornado could come through. So
Yeah.
I never found Wisconsin people eager to talk about themselves, but once they started, it was kind of hard to stop them. I tried not to ever mock anybody in the column. I just found some of their habits to be interesting, and also the seriousness with which people did certain things that I found, I'll admit now, I found it hard to believe you could be this serious about something. One of them, I was thinking for years, I wrote for the St. Paul Pioneer Press. That was part of the syndicate. So I had to do a certain number of stories out in Western Wisconsin. And I would go by a little store, I think it was just outside River Falls. And the sign on the front of the stores said taxidermy and cheese. And I thought, that's kind of odd. You're selling worms and cheese. And I remember walking in and saying to this guy, hi, my name's Steve Hanna. And he'd say, I know you. Frequently, people said, yeah, I read that column you do in the, I said, well, do you like it at all? And he said, sometimes it's okay. People were really, they weren't going to suck up to me. And I said,
honest, yeah.
So what are you doing here? And I said, well, you have a sign on the front of your building that says taxidermy. I get that, you stuff things that are dead. And cheese, you're selling cheese too. So you see, like taxidermy and cheese, how that might appeal to me. And he said, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. What strikes you as funny about that? And I said, well, you got a cooler here full of cheese. People are going to eat that. And then you've got, you got worms, you got
dead animals around. Yeah,
and the guy was, it took a while to convince him that he never did believe it was funny at all, but there was always that sort of juxtaposition. And the great difference between Wisconsin and where I grew up in metropolitan New York was metropolitan New York is loud, and it kind of reminds me of, I'll say it, our president. Lots of people, whatever they're doing is huge. It's unbelievable. It's vague, but it's huge and unbelievable and great. There's never been anything quite like it. Whereas in Wisconsin, when I interviewed a guy or two guys who won millions of dollars in the lottery, they were on the Miracle Mile in Fond du Lac. One poor soul only won $10 million. He worked at, Mercury Marine. And I said, so what are you going to do with that money? And he said, I may buy one of those KitchenAid blenders. And I said, you got $10 million. And he said, and he looked at me just, straight as a string. And he said, I like to cook. And then I went up the street and found a junior high teacher who had won $100 million, which you'd think would be life-changing. And when I asked him what he was going to do with $100 million and how did it make him feel, and this was really this is in the back of my head or sometimes in the forefront during the writing of the book. He looked at me and when I said, how do you feel about $100 million? And he said, not too bad. And I thought, I actually wanted to name the book, not Dairylandia, but I wanted to call it Not Too Bad. And I had a bit of a tussle with the University of Wisconsin Press, and I was with my lawyer one day actually, and I said, they can't do this to me. I mean, I'm writing the book. It's my book. And he said, well, actually, the contract says that in the case of a tie, like baseball, the tie goes to the runner. In the case of a tie, the tie goes to the publisher. So I think it's going to be Dairylandia, which I'm happy about. But I wanted to call it Not Too Bad because I thought that summarized so succinctly the sort of Wisconsin attitude.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned that you never set out to mock anybody, but I would imagine sometimes that's a tricky balance because you want to tell someone's story and be true to someone's story and their character and personality, and get that across to somebody who's never met that person. But you have to do so in a way that isn't cynical or mocking or satire. I would imagine that at times, depending on the person, that was probably a tricky balance to, to kind of, toe that line, I guess.
Yeah,
or walk that line.
It was tricky. I think that the trick to that tricky balance was to stick to what the people said. It wasn't for me to say, you're really going to get a kick out of this because this is so absurd. I would simply let someone say something. There are people I spoke to. I love the older people. They were terrific, but occasionally they would lose their way, as I do. And I always thought it was great when they were talking about one thing, and then all of a sudden, the guy, the frogger up in Oconto, for example, was telling me about selling frogs to restaurants in Chicago. And then all of a sudden he'd say, did I ever tell you about the time that me and my brother Jim caught 10,000 frogs, and we put them in our parents' basement, and we put them in a pen, and they sang. He said, I wish I could remember his words exactly. He said they'd like to bring the roof down, and then he would stop and he would say, them were frogs. And to me, this was kind of entertaining. And I'm sure when Art read it, he just said, no, I said them were frogs. There were times when I got in a, I don't know if I can say this, a pissing match.
Sure.
Yeah, I already said it.
We're all adults here.
I got a letter one time from a guy, and sometimes a column, the wonderful thing about a column is that if you get enough response, it'll go on and on and on, and then you won't have to think of anything new for the next week. And I once got a letter from a guy who said, he lived in Janesville, and he said, I read your column in the Janesville Gazette, and I see this picture of this guy, and he's got wavy black hair and a black beard. He said, and then I was driving up to Minneapolis to see my daughter. And so I saw your picture in the Saturday Janesville Gazette, and then I drove up to Minneapolis to see my daughter. And by the time I got there, I bought the St. Paul Pioneer Press on Sunday, and it's like two different guys. It's this older guy, and he's got gray hair, and what happened along the way from Janesville to Minneapolis? And I said, I got older. And I said, you could send me a picture of you. This was a good way to do a column too, because I'd say, you could send me a picture of you like 10 years ago and a picture of you today. And let's see how you've evolved exactly. This ended up being a series of columns because the mayor of Menominee, Wisconsin, wrote me a letter, just a really funny letter, and said, you're aging, Steve, I got to tell you, and you're not aging that well. And I called his wife and I said, would you send me a picture of Dennis? I can't remember his last name, like 10 years ago. And so I then wrote a column directed to Dennis that Sunday and said, Dennis, I've got a picture of you right here. And I ran the two pictures, his current mayoral picture. And I said, between the two of us, I said, I think I'm doing a lot better than you are. And this ended up being 4 or 5 columns in a row in which Dennis maintained that he looked terrific and he was aging gracefully. And I said, no, you're just kind of a homely guy. And on top of that, you're feeding at the public trough. You're the mayor of Menominee. You're probably stealing money on the side. And he had a great sense of humor, and we had a wonderful exchange. So that's another way to acquire an idea.
So along with Old
And I
people,
was,
you mentioned that
I,
you,
I was mocking him, Chad, you know.
sure, yeah, exactly.
We were
But
mocking
in
each other.
good nature. I mean, like, and
Yeah,
plus he started it, so
he
that's
started,
why.
and he was, I thought, much homelier than I was. So that was my view.
So along with older people that you like to write about, there's also a fair amount in the book, and I would imagine over the course of your columns, about agriculture, farming as
Yeah.
well. Does that stem from growing up in the metropolitan East Coast? And so once you get to Wisconsin, you're just amazed by all of the agriculture around? Or what is it about farming and agriculture that interests you or interested you so much?
Well, what interested me was getting hired as the farm reporter and having a steady income. That's what mainly interested me. I did not know the front end from the back end of a column, of a cow rather. I had written a couple of stories when I first got here. I was freelancing for the Sentinel and the Milwaukee Journal and the Capital Times in Madison, the State Journal, and I had written a story about some farmers who were raising milk, and it was costing them $11.50 to raise 100 pounds of milk, and under the federal price supports they get paid $10. And I said, that's not a very good business. You're losing $1.50. And so I wrote one story, and on the basis of that, the Journal called me one day and said, our farm reporter is leaving, and we think you'd make a great farm reporter. And I said, what makes you think that? I mean, it certainly can't be knowledge, because I don't know anything. But I again, following in my father's footsteps, I said, after questioning him a little bit, I said, what does it pay exactly? And I think it was $12,500. And he said, you get a new car every 3 years and you can drive all around Wisconsin. So I said, I am your farm reporter. I'm the guy you've been looking for forever. And then it was just a question of learning how to do it. I had so many, and I knew absolutely nothing. And at the time, even though, it's a multi-billion-dollar business in Wisconsin, it was a kind of, even the Milwaukee journals, even though we had this huge circulation outstate, the lion's share of the circulation was concentrated in Milwaukee. So I would write stories that would get into the editions that went out into the state or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We had a separate edition. But when I made the city edition, that was a really big deal for me, because they would just arbitrarily cut anything that had to do with farming out of the city paper. Although they'd said to me when they hired me first, it's going to be your job to teach them about agriculture, which I thought was hysterically funny. I'm going to teach anybody about agriculture. But I turned out I just loved the job. I loved traveling around. I loved meeting the people. They were kind to me. They were patient, which was even more important than being kind. And I learned a lot about agriculture, enough so that I at times thought I knew much more than I did. And I do have a story from the very early days of being a farm reporter for the Journal, in which my editor said, I want you to go out at the end of a really wicked winter. And he said to write about farmers getting back in the field. And I saw this as an opportunity to write the sort of coming of spring story of the ages. Not just a story for the rural editions, but I was going to write this, I was going to be the Wordsworth of Wisconsin. And I went out, and I'll try to make this short. I found a farmer over in Arlington, Wisconsin. I just spied him. He was on a tractor and he was headed toward me, and I parked along Highway 60, and I was waiting there, and I had, at the time I had very curly long hair and a beard, and I had my reporter's tie on, so I looked really pretty. And I stood by the fence, and the guy miraculously started coming toward me, and I started waving and waving to try to get him to stop. And when he stopped, he got off the farm, and he was wearing a hat that said, I'll never forget, Polled Herefords, the big bold breed. And he was chewing on the stub end of a toothpick, and he just said, what? Yeah. So I said, and I said this really fast. My name is Steve Hann. I work for the Milwaukee Journal. I've been sent out here to write the story. This must be an extraordinary time of year for you. Your farm dog is rolling in the alfalfa, and you're once again in commune with nature, and you're part of this this turn of the earth, and this cycle. And you're growing food for people, and it's all this kind of flowery nonsense. And he just never smiled and just stared at me. And then finally at the end, he said, "You done?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Yeah, it's a lot like that out here. We like to take the seeds out of the bag and put them in the ground. Otherwise the crops don't grow that good." And then he got on his tractor and drove away. That was the end of it. And I realized that farmers don't have a lot of time to waste talking to the guy in the coat and tie who doesn't really know what he's talking about. And I wrote the story, maybe interestingly, I wrote the story about how the guy had made a complete and utter fool of me, and how I'd learned from this that farmers don't have a lot of time to waste, and they're certainly not interested in all that poetic nonsense yeah.
Boy, and those were the days too. A newspaper giving you a car to use every 3 years. That's not gonna happen much these days, I would imagine.
No.
The first publishers that you approached about a book were pretty excited because they all thought or wanted you to write a book about the Onion, but you wanted to take it in a different direction. And you talk about that a bit in the book. But do you think you would ever write a book about the Onion at any time, or are you past that?
I think that I may write a book about the Onion. What you're referring to is in the opening of the book, in which two friends of mine who are real professional book writers and make a living at it, both said, let me introduce you to my A-list agents in New York, and it's going to be great, and you're going to get rich. They're going to love this because they love everybody. It's everyone's patriotic obligation to love the Onion, whether they've ever read it or not. I found that over my 12 years at the Onion. And I went to New York and met with these guys, and they said, "Man, you are here at the greatest time. I mean, you ran the Onion for all those years, and you got to be a funny guy." And I said, "Actually, I never wrote the jokes. That was somebody else. I was counting the beans." More than that, the editorial department reported to me, but with those people, comedy writers, anybody who's ever going to manage them, my first piece of advice would be leave them alone. If you try to manage them, you'll ruin everything. But anyway, after telling these guys, they said, so if you're not going to write about the Onion, what in the world are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm going to write about Wisconsin. I'm like this guy from the East Coast who ends up in Wisconsin, this really lyrical, mystical, different place in the middle of the country, and there are actually really live, fascinating people there. And I had the good fortune of meeting them. And that's what I'm writing about. And they said, and they showed me the door and said, if you ever come to your senses, come back and we will. I actually went to I think it was the National Booksellers Fair in Cleveland last year. And I had this gigantic picture of Dairylandia back here, and I had to stand in a booth and be charming to people, which is always difficult. And I'd say a third of the people who came up to me were publishers who said, I'll give you a contract today, sight unseen, if you'll write a book about the Onion for me. And the Onion was, they're brilliant writers, but as I said, I think the other day to someone, I sort of break the comedy down into, there are two different kinds of approaches to comedy. One is this excruciating, the Onion, 15 writers in a room, just mercilessly beating up on one another's jokes till every single syllable was perfect. And then my approach was I think the line in the book was, there are some people who write and work at it so precisely that you get a perfect joke at the end of it. And then there are people who are just naturally and often unintentionally funny, and they're just the kind of people who make you want to spit out your beer. And I prefer the spit out your beer types. Although I loved the Onion, and I could give you hundreds of Onion, stories of Onion things that were very funny. The book that I would ever write about the Onion would be things that happened to me as a result of things that happened in the paper. Since I was the CEO, I was the brunt of all the, we had a lot of people unhappy with us a lot of days. A lot of people loved us, but a lot of people were very unhappy, and I was generally first line of defense. The editors were not very interested. Unlike, Pat would know this, in the newspaper business, when you're the editor, and you're responsible for the editorial content. When things go wrong, they come after you. When things go wrong at the Onion, they came after me, because our editors basically said, we don't do that. We're not going to. And they also felt that in keeping in character, that it would be beneath them to actually engage in any kind of conversation with the great unwashed. But I had to, and that presented lots of really interesting and funny things that happened in my life.
Sure. Well, that makes me wonder too. And I worked as a newspaper reporter for a while, and I had some people come after me after stories that I wrote. Did you ever have, with any of the State of Mind columns, people who were really upset about what you wrote, as far as what you wrote about them, who took offense to what you wrote?
Oh, I'm sure I did, but you caught me unawares here. At the moment, State of Mind, let me be honest, it was not hard-hitting Woodward and Bernstein journalism. It was, I'd done a lot of that. I'd done it in East Germany. I'd done it in China. I once spent 6 months investigating the deaths of a bunch of guys who were blown up in a grain elevator in New Orleans. And I went all the way from New Orleans up to Superior, looking at how the people who worked in the grain elevators applied pesticides. And that was, people were always mad at me then. Politicians were always mad at me. Senator Herb Kohl wanted to string me up. I mean, lots of politicians were really unhappy with me, sometimes justifiably. But I can't remember off the top of my head. People at the Onion, trust me, were really mad, from starting with Donald Trump, and I had a number of really good rows with his attorney, his name, Michael Cohen, who threatened
Roy Cohen.
Well, Roy Cohen was his first attorney. Michael Cohen is his attorney, who's
Michael Cohen, right? The other one.
serving time.
Of course.
He threatened me because we found Trump to be like every politician. When Trump would do something silly, we thought, in keeping with our motto on the Onion editorial page, which was "Tu stultus es," which means you are stupid. Whether you were left or right or center or regardless of what job you occupied, we thought you were fair game. And Trump often did things that we found hilarious. And
nothing was off limits. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. When we first thought about, my lawyer first called me in like 2000 one day out of the blue and said, and he represented the Onion. I wasn't even aware of that. He said, do you have any interest in buying the Onion? And I said, well, I don't have enough money to buy the Onion, but I might be able to get together a group that could do it. I flew to New York to see the editor of the Onion. His name was Rob Siegel, and he was a terrific editor at the Onion. He then went on to do movies and had great success, got some Oscar nominations, et cetera. But I remember sitting there with Rob and saying, where do you draw the line? And he looked at me as if, I'm the most naive character in the world. And I've been reading The Onion for years. And he said, there is no line.
Yeah.
I said, well, there's got to be a line. I mean, decency of something. And he said, no line whatsoever. Everything is fair game. And
Sure.
Of course, when I first began running The Onion, it was hard for me to get used to, having spent my life in what we'd call straight journalism for many years. It was hard for me to get used to the notion that there was no line. And I would object and go in and talk to the editor and say, we can't publish this. I mean, this is, and then over time, your sensitivities really get inured. I mean, pretty soon there was almost nothing that offended me. A few times, but not very often. And
yeah, well, it's a joy to read. Well, I think we'll have to kind of wrap things up. We talked about maybe you reading a chapter. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time for that, but you are in the process of recording an audiobook version of Dairylandia. So eventually people can hear you read the stories in the book. Do you have any timeline for when the audiobook might be available?
I'm hoping before the end of the year. I mean, everybody who's publishing anything wants things to be available for Christmas. So
Sure.
I think it's possible that it'll be done in October, and if not November. I think it'll be ready before Christmas, and you'll be able to buy it at your favorite Audible outlet.
Cool.
And I would encourage you to buy 15 or 20 for everybody on your shopping list for Christmas this year. But
Indeed. Well, yep, we thank you very much, folks. If you check your chat, you'll see a link to a survey for our book festival. We'd love to get some feedback on how we're doing, and if you have ideas for other festivals, future festivals, that sort of thing. There's also a link to the rest of the schedule for the rest of the weekend. We've got a pretty full day today and more events tomorrow as well. But for now, Steve Hanna, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a lot of fun, and yeah, thanks for sharing your work and your thoughts and your history with all of us. We really, really appreciate it.
well, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me. And I think what you're doing with this book festival and doing it anytime is wonderful, but doing it, keeping it alive and doing it right now during this particular moment in time, I think is even better. So
it's a lot of fun to put together, and yeah, we appreciate that. Yeah, very much. So.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. We'll maybe see you later at another event. And if not, thanks for tuning in today.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye-bye
Great
now.
to meet you.
Bye-bye.
Likewise. Bye-bye.